For 136 years, the most notorious killer in history hid behind a name no one could prove. A single bloodstained shawl exposed what Scotland Yard never could. In the autumn of 1888, the streets of Whitechapel became a hunting ground. 11 women were murdered that year, but 5 names would echo through the decades: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Each lived on the edge of survival, their lives mapped out in workhouse ledgers and police records, their daily existence shaped by poverty, addiction, and the constant threat of violence. Nichols, a laundress, drifted from one shelter to the next. Annie Chapman, once a domestic servant, slept rough after her marriage collapsed. Elizabeth Stride, a seamstress with Polish-Jewish roots, tried to find steady work but often ended up in the doss houses of Berner Street. Catherine Eddowes, also of Polish-Jewish descent, worked as a laundress and sometimes sold trinkets to get by. Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest, was a prostitute who rented a single room on Dorset Street. These women were not nameless victims in a Gothic legend. They were mothers, daughters, and friends, each with a story cut short by brutality. Police files logged their names alongside those of 11 suspects, but the scale of the investigation only seemed to magnify the sense of helplessness. Detectives scoured alleyways, questioned hundreds, and filled pages with witness statements, but the killer slipped away every time. Inquests and press reports fixated on the violence, yet the women themselves faded from public concern, their lives overshadowed by the myth that grew in the Ripper's wake. For the authorities, the case became a puzzle of evidence and dead ends. For the women of Whitechapel, it was a daily reminder of how easily they could disappear, how little their safety mattered in the eyes of those in power. The story of Jack the Ripper always begins with blood and terror, but it is rooted in the lives of the women who were lost and the city that failed to protect them. Aaron Kosminski's name appeared in police files long before DNA entered the story. Born in Congress, Poland in 1865, he arrived in Whitechapel as a teenager, part of a wave of Jewish families fleeing pogroms and poverty. He worked as a barber, lived in the heart of the East End, and by 1888 his daily route traced the same narrow streets where the murders took place. But for the police, Kosminski was more than a local misfit. He was a walking risk, both to public safety and to the fragile peace of a city on edge. That summer, Whitechapel was already a powder keg. The Pitt Street riot in August 1888 saw thousands descend on Jewish homes, hurling bricks and breaking windows. Police reports counted dozens injured, with reinforcements called in from across London. The press stoked fears of an alien invasion, blaming Eastern European Jews for crime, disease, and lost jobs. Members of Parliament debated new immigration laws, warning that the East End was on the brink of a pogrom. Every murder tightened the tension. When rumours spread that the killer might be a Jew, the threat of mob violence hung over every decision Scotland Yard made. Inside the force, Kosminski's file grew thicker. He was known for erratic behaviour, talking to himself in the street, refusing to eat, sometimes violent, always fragile. By early 1889, his family brought him before magistrates for his own protection. 2 years later, in February 1891, he was committed to Colney Hatch Asylum. The records describe him as delusional, emaciated, and tormented by voices. He would spend the rest of his life behind asylum walls, dying in Leavesden Hospital in 1919. The murders stopped after his committal. Yet for all the evidence gathered, the police never pressed charges. Internal memos, kept secret for decades, named Kosminski as the most likely suspect. But to arrest and publicly accuse a Polish Jew at the height of East End unrest risked unleashing riots the authorities could not control. Maintaining order took priority over justice for 5 murdered women. In the shadows of Whitechapel, the silence was not just about what the police didn't know. It was about what they dared not say. Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson was on duty the night Catherine Eddowes died. Family legend claims he returned home with a long silk shawl, its dark stains still fresh, its origin never recorded in police files. The official inventory from Mitre Square makes no mention of this item. There is no property ledger, no station report, no press account describing a shawl taken for evidence or as a keepsake. Yet within the Simpson family, the story persisted. Amos had brought home a relic from the Ripper's handiwork, a token meant for his wife, folded away in a wooden box and left untouched for decades. The shawl passed quietly from one generation to the next, its presence known only through whispered stories and the occasional glimpse at family gatherings. No receipts, no estate inventories, not even a faded photograph tie the fabric to Eddowes or to the crime scene. At one point, descendants claimed it was briefly loaned to Scotland Yard's Black Museum, but no records confirm this. The chain of ownership relies entirely on oral tradition, Simpson's word to his children and their word to theirs. In the absence of documentation, the shawl slipped into the shadows of private life, more curiosity than evidence, its stains growing darker with each retelling. By the late 20th century, collectors and amateur historians began to circle. The shawl surfaced at local fairs, then disappeared again, its authenticity debated but never resolved. Storage conditions were casual, a bedroom drawer, a family trunk, sometimes on display at a Ripper-themed exhibition. No one kept track of who handled it or how often. For more than a century, the artifact lived outside the boundaries of official scrutiny, its true history murky, its link to Whitechapel unproven. The question lingered. Could this unlisted, unguarded scrap of silk really hold the answer to the world's most infamous murder mystery? Or was it just another ghost story, passed down in the dark? In 2007, the shawl surfaced at auction, its story trailing a century of rumor and doubt. The sale drew headlines, but not for the reasons its owners hoped. Questions about authenticity and the missing police records forced the auction house to halt the proceedings. No official document tied the fabric to Catherine Eddowes or to the night of her murder. No chain of custody log, no forensic seal, just a handwritten note and a family legend. Yet the shadow of Whitechapel clung to the silk, and the object found a new owner. Russell Edwards, a businessman obsessed with the Ripper case, stepped in and bought the shawl outright. He saw not just a relic, but a last chance for science to do what Victorian detectives could not. Edwards did not keep his prize under glass. He delivered it to Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist with a reputation for extracting DNA from the most unlikely sources. The handover was formal, with signed transfer forms, detailed logs, and a new chain of custody that began the moment the shawl entered the laboratory. For the first time, the artifact left the world of rumor and entered the world of controlled evidence. Louhelainen and his team set out to map every stain and fiber, documenting each step to prevent the contamination that had haunted the shawl's past. Every swab, every sample was tracked and sealed. The silk was now more than a curiosity. It was a test case for whether modern forensics could resurrect justice from the chaos of history. The laboratory's protocols were strict, designed to answer a question that had eluded generations. Could this piece of cloth, passed through so many hands, finally reveal the truth about Jack the Ripper? Inside a sealed laboratory, the shawl's journey from rumor to evidence began with a single, carefully gloved hand. Dr. Jari Louhelainen's team logged every movement, every sample, as if the past century's chaos might still cling to the silk. The fabric was stored at -80 degrees Celsius, its stains mapped under ambient, ultraviolet, and infrared light. Each dark patch, whether blood or what might have been semen, was photographed, catalogued, and assigned a unique code. Forensic scientists swabbed the surface twice, first with a buffer to sweep away any trace of modern DNA, then with a second swab to capture what remained deep in the weave. The most promising stains underwent laser capture microdissection, a technique that isolates single cells under a microscope. Here, the smallest fragments mattered most. DNA from the 19th century is shattered, less than 100 base pairs at a time, a handful of letters in a story nearly erased by time and mishandling. The team used whole genome amplification and targeted only the mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material most likely to survive centuries of neglect. 6 out of 8 tiny fragments yielded readable sequences. Each result was cross-checked against the EMPO population database for statistical weight. Contamination haunted every step. Negative control swabs, extraction blanks, and DNA profiles from every handler were compared to the sequences pulled from the shawl. The lab's clean room was a fortress, UV sterilized benches, filtered air, and a strict log of personnel. No modern DNA appeared in the critical stains. The workflow mirrored protocols used to identify the Romanovs and Richard III, but with a far greater handicap. The silk's poor preservation forced the team to work with fragments a quarter the length of those royal cases. Still, the methodology held. Every step, every result was documented and peer-reviewed before the findings saw daylight. In the end, the evidence would rest not just on what the DNA revealed, but on whether the world could trust that these ancient, fragile molecules had survived the journey uncorrupted. 6 fragments of mitochondrial DNA, pried from blood and what looked like semen, delivered the answer that had eluded generations. The lab's protocols held. No stray profiles from modern hands, no contamination in the blanks. One sequence matched a living maternal descendant of Catherine Eddowes. The other, drawn from the suspected semen stain, matched a living descendant from the maternal line of Aaron Kosminski's sister. 2 names, separated by a century, now bound together by the same thread of genetic code. The odds of such a double match, 1 in 40,000, stood in stark contrast to the thousands of suspects and dead ends that had come before. The data went further. From a handful of single nucleotide polymorphisms, tiny variations in the DNA, the team inferred the suspect's physical traits: male with brown hair and brown eyes, a profile that fit the witness descriptions scribbled into Victorian police ledgers. The shawl, for all its years in private hands, had preserved not just the blood of a victim, but the genetic shadow of her killer. Confirmation came quietly. The descendants, both off-screen, agreed to the testing. Their samples, anonymized and processed under strict controls, formed the bookends of a story that had begun in a filthy alley and ended in a clean room. The science was clear, the statistics cold. 2 families, 2 lines of inheritance converged on the same scrap of silk. Shock rippled through the Ripper world. Forensic breakthroughs in royal cases, the Romanovs and Richard III had relied on better preserved material, longer DNA fragments, and far clearer provenance. Here, the evidence was fragile, the history tangled, the match improbable. Yet the result was undeniable. A double genetic link impossible to ignore. The question that haunted the case for more than a century returned with new force. If the science could do what the police could not, what else had been missed, overlooked, or left unsolved because the right evidence was simply ignored? Doubts followed the DNA results as quickly as headlines. For every claim of scientific certainty, there was a chorus of geneticists and forensic experts urging caution. The shawl's long, undocumented journey, decades in family closets, private trunks, and hands ungloved, raised the specter of contamination that no modern protocol could erase. Critics pointed out that the fabric had been exposed to air, dust, and countless handlers for over a century. No one could say for sure what invisible traces had settled into its fibers before it ever saw the inside of a laboratory freezer. The heart of the controversy beat in the missing data. While the published study in the Journal of Forensic Sciences described its methods in detail, it withheld the raw electropherograms, the underlying readouts that allow independent scientists to check for errors, dropouts, or ambiguous calls. Without those files, outside experts were left to trust the author's interpretations, a leap of faith that few in the forensic community were willing to make. The laboratory's controls looked thorough on paper, but no one beyond the original team had seen the unfiltered results. Questions piled up. Could the mitochondrial DNA recovered from the shawl really be separated from the DNA of every collector, every family member, every auctioneer who ever touched it? Was the match to Kosminski's maternal line as rare as the statistics claimed? Or was it a haplotype shared by thousands of people in Victorian London? Even the use of laser capture microdissection, meant to isolate single cells, came under fire. Some argued that the technique could just as easily pick up modern skin flakes or environmental debris, especially from a textile handled so carelessly for so long. In the absence of open data, the debate became less about what the shawl revealed and more about what it could ever prove. Science had delivered a tantalizing answer, but it could not silence the questions that haunted every cold case. How much trust can be placed in evidence that was never meant to survive its own century? In a locked office at Scotland Yard, the truth was written down and set aside. The McNarton Memorandum, dated February 23, 1894, named Aaron Kosminski outright, a Polish Jew of unsound mind who harbored a great hatred of women. The memo described him as a man who threatened to cut women's throats, who had been institutionalized before any serious steps could be taken. Strong evidence, it said, but not enough for trial. The document never saw the light of day. It circulated only among senior officers, its details withheld from the public, the press, and even Parliament. No one outside those walls would know that the police had settled on a suspect. The silence was not a matter of uncertainty. It was a choice. In the years after the murders, anti-Semitic riots swept the East End, crowds of thousands hurling bricks at Jewish homes. Police were forced to charge with batons to keep order. To name Kosminski publicly would have risked unleashing violence on a scale the authorities feared they could not contain. The calculus was brutal. Protect the city's fragile peace, or seek justice for 5 murdered women no one in power seemed to miss. In the end, the women were forgotten, their killer locked away in an asylum, their names left to fade in the ledgers of the poor. The legend of Jack the Ripper grew in the vacuum left by official silence. The killer became a phantom, a genius, a symbol of evil too clever to be caught. But the real story was smaller, sadder, and infinitely more damning. Scotland Yard had a name, a face, a file thick with warnings and witness statements. They chose not to act, not because they could not, but because the cost of truth was judged too high. The myth endured because the truth was inconvenient and the lives lost were easily ignored. Cold cases don't linger because answers are impossible. They linger because some lives are easier to forget. Today, mitochondrial DNA can solve crimes once thought unsolvable. but only if society values every victim equally. The DNA finally gave us a name, but the real mystery was never who Jack the Ripper was. It was why everyone in power already knew and chose silence.